Richard Weaver has famously said that ideas have consequences. One of the things that's important to remember about that is that ideas have consequences for real people. Sometimes we think that ideas are just kind of words on a page and concepts to be debated and kind of, tossed back and forth. But really, ideas grow feet. They walk out into the world in various ways, and then they have great impact on people's lives, how we think about ourselves, how we think about what makes life a good life, how we think about others, how we think about our communities and societies, the past and the future. That's why we have social revolutions. And I say this carefully. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that despite all the political revolutions and the global shifts that have taken place in the 20th century until today, there's not been a more successful, and by successful, I mean holistically influential in so many different aspects of life in the world. Of all of those social revolutions, the most successful one that we have seen, at least in our lifetimes, has been the sexual revolution. Now, the sexual revolution wasn't necessarily a political revolution like some of the others were. It's pre-political. It didn't just shape our understanding of government or who was in charge and which laws we wanted to have and how we wanted to, manage our economic lives or something like that. No, the sexual revolution has top to bottom influenced politics, entertainment, law, religion, even the sciences, including biology, not just the social sciences, but also the hard sciences. It's an amazing thing when you think about how much of the world we think about differently because of the sexual revolution. I want to just talk about really the ideas at the heart of the sexual revolution. And there's a lot, but I think we can really highlight three very important ideas of the sexual revolution, things that weren't actually prominent or embraced ideas just a few decades ago, and today are basically taken for granted. These are ideas that went, in some cases, from being unthinkable to unquestionable. In other words, these are the ideas that are taken for granted when we think about almost anything else after the sexual revolution. Here's the first. The first idea of the sexual revolution is that sex, marriage, and babies are separable. Sex, marriage, and babies are separable. Now, prior to the 20th century, sex, marriage, and babies were seen as a package deal. And the reason that sex, marriage, and babies were seen as a package deal was because of kind of three fundamental realities that were true wherever humans were. Number one, sex makes babies. Number two, society cares about babies. Society cares about babies because without babies, societies don't have a future. So they matter not only to the individuals, the moms and the dads, but they actually, matter to the community. So sex makes babies, society needs babies, and babies need a mom and a dad, or at least the best way to secure a baby's future is through a mom and a dad. Now, there was some debate about that. There were some cultures that thought babies should be citizens of the state and not necessarily, owned or cared for primarily by the mom and the dad, but that became unwieldy. There was no way to actually sustain that, and scale that to any sort of meaningful way. So you have moms and dads. And so sex makes babies, society needs babies, and babies do best with a mom and a dad, and marriage is the thing that holds moms and dads together. And so therefore, throughout most of history, it was just assumed that sex, marriage, and babies were a package deal. You can see this, by the way, in how we think and talk about, our life together before. I'll give you an example. When I went to get a marriage license and asked my wife to marry me, good news is she said yes. But this was in a little town in Tennessee. And I went and said, hey, I need a marriage license. And she said, well, before I can give you a marriage license, I need to ask you a couple questions. The first question was, are you both old enough? The second question is, are you part of any other marriage right now? The third question is, are you related in any way? Now, those were really interesting questions, weren't they? Because really what those questions presumed was that there was an inherent connection between marriage and sex and children. For example, why is it that when I asked to have a marriage license, they said, are you old enough? Well, because that has to do with sexual consent. It has to do with the fact that if you're not 18, you're still a child belonging to another family. Why did they ask if we were already married to someone else? Why does the government care that you're about bigamist? Why does the government why does it care that you're married to one person and not another? Well, because there's likely families that result from that, and they have to make sure the kids are taken care of. And that's, by the way, the reason they ask the third question, are you related in any way? The government doesn't really care about the sincerity of your love when it comes to love between siblings, if it happens to be romantic. What the government cares about are children, because again, sex, marriage, and babies were always seen as a package deal. It's only quite recently that it was even possible to conceive of sex, marriage, and babies not being a package deal. And this is one of the things we need to understand about social revolutions, is that every social revolution, including the sexual revolution, is made up of ideas, but ideas aren't enough. Ideas require artifacts in order to change culture. And by artifacts, I mean they have to take real tangible form. An example is if you think about the Protestant Reformation, big social revolution. Protestant Reformation communicated an idea called the priesthood of all believers, which basically said you didn't have to go to church in order to communicate with God. You can go right to God through Jesus Christ in prayer. Priesthood of all believers. But the problem is that Holy Scripture was in Latin, and the only literate people were the churchmen, and they had the Scripture. So if you wanted to know what God said, you had to go to church in order to get that. One of the things that preceded the Protestant Reformation, which made it possible for the ideas of the Protestant Reformation to take root, was getting the Bible into the hands of everyday people. And that required a translation from the Latin that happened with some of the pre-reformers. And then it required an invention that would make the production of books like the Bible much cheaper. And that's why Time magazine several years ago named the greatest invention in the history of the world the printing press, because it made that idea thinkable. In the same way, this idea of the sexual revolution, that sex, marriage, and babies are a package deal, required an invention, something that made it possible to conceive of sex and marriage and babies in separate terms. And that, of course, was the pill, contraception, because that made it possible to have sex outside of marriage. So if we talk about this package deal, this triangle of sex, marriage, and babies together, the way this has proceeded historically is, first we wanted a way to justify, and there's always been sex outside of marriage, but there's always been marriage connected with sex, and there's always been this vision that sex and marriage belong together because of the babies that might result. So the only way to separate sex and marriage is to separate sex and children, and that's what the pill made possible. But that was only the start. So first sex was separated from marriage, and the way you separate sex from marriage is separating it from babies. And then we wanted to separate babies from marriage, the taboo of an unwed mother, of a child born out of wedlock. There's a story about this from the 90s. It's one of the weirdest moments in American political history, when there was a public debate or a spat between a real-life political candidate, Dan Quayle, running for president, and a sitcom star sitcom character. She didn't actually exist in real life, Murphy Brown. Murphy Brown was a professional woman who wanted to have a child. Dan Quayle said that was a bad example because kids should be born in marriage and we shouldn't celebrate or choose intentionally to have a child outside of a marital relationship. And he was widely panned. It probably cost him the election, either that or because he couldn't spell potato. But what happened, it ended up is that this became a whole public thing. 20 years later, it's fascinating that the cover story of the New Yorker said, hey, 20 years later, turns out Dan Quayle was right, that kids actually do better in the context of a marriage when their mom and dad are married and stay together. In fact, there are a few things that are more clear from the data that the single best situation for a child's long-term success is that they're raised in a home with married mom and dad. And it's almost as if marriage and sex and babies belong together. But that's the process of separation in the sexual revolution. First, we separate sex from marriage. The only way to do that is to separate sex from babies. Then we want to separate babies from marriage. Then we want to separate marriage from babies. The idea of an intentionally childless marriage, not an unintentional. I'm not talking about, someone dealing with infertility. In fact, someone dealing with infertility almost points to the fact that how tragic it is, because it's almost as if something it is for many of folks who struggle with this, something's missing. This is what belongs. It was unthinkable until quite recently, particularly among Christians, that someone would get married planning not to have children. And of course, the pill made that possible as well. So sex is separated from marriage. That happens by separating sex from babies, babies separated from marriage, marriage separating from babies. And now we have the final chapter. that is having babies without sex. And our artificial reproductive technologies now have completely enabled this to a degree that many of us did not even foresee just how powerful it would be. In the years leading up to the Obergefell decision, which was the decision from the Supreme Court that mandated same-sex marriage on the United States. There were about 30-some states at the time who had passed state-level law, including some more progressive states like California, defining marriage as a relationship between a man and a woman. Well, the argument was, look, marriage, one of the arguments was, look, this doesn't have anything to do with children. It's love is love. Love is love. Love is love. Now, that's observably not true. Sexual love between a man and a woman is observably different than sexual love between two women and two men. Heterosexual love is actually procreative, and homosexual love is not procreative. This isn't magic, or it's math. This isn't bigotry, as one of my friends says. It's biology. And interestingly enough, to advance the argument of same-sex marriage, it was often brought up in the public square that, well, marriage isn't really about children anymore. Marriage doesn't have anything to do with kids. It's just about the government not discriminating against this kind of love. Well, I guess by and large, the Western world has bought that. But what's so interesting now is we have these artificial reproductive technologies, which prioritize surrogacy, in some parts of the world, commercial surrogacy, where women can be hired to carry children for others. We have in vitro fertilization, where actually babies are created outside of the sexual process. This is the final divorce, not only of sex from marriage and marriage from babies and babies from marriage and marriage from babies, but now babies from sex itself. And now what's happened recently in the Western world, especially in America, through the advancement of some of these laws protecting and advancing what's called presumed parentage acts. These are laws that basically say if we're allowed to get married, then having children then becomes a right. And these artificial reproductive technologies that don't require sex are now required in some states to be covered by insurance plans. So think about this. A couple that has chosen a relationship that's inherently sterile now requires or demands children as a result. It's the final separation of sex, marriage, and babies. By the way, at every stage of separating sex, marriage, and babies, there was a line, a myth that was repeated in various forms, but it was various forms of the same myth, and that is, oh, the kids will be fine. You know, a no-fault divorce, separating marriage and, the kids will be fine. They're resilient. Kids want happy parents. They don't need married parents as much as they need happy parents. Or outside of, wedlock, the kids will be fine. They don't need a mom and a dad. They just need a loving, stable environment. The real problem is poverty, or the real problem is not the loss of moms or dads. Instead of having a mom and a dad, two dads or two moms, kids will be fine. Kids need loving parents, not moms and dads. What you need to understand is that every single study that we know of points to the fact that kids do better in homes with married mom and dads than any other situation, and that both moms and dads bring unique and different things to the lives of their children. So moms can't be dads and dads can't be moms. And yet here we are with this separation of sex, marriage, and babies, and what we pretend is the kids will be fine. Ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims, because our ideas walk into the real world and change how we think about ourselves and how we think about others. The disproportionate victims of the sexual revolution, especially that first idea that sex, marriage, and babies are separable, has been always children, over and over and over. And what we do is we denigrate the rights of children and we elevate the desires of adults at the risk of the children.